Pues darles la bienvenida a todos ustedes a esta sesión en la que pretendemos presentar el estado en el que se encuentra una iniciativa que hace año y medio más o menos pusimos en marcha, una iniciativa científico-tecnológica en torno a la Ciudad del Futuro y que coordina el profesor Uceda, que está con nosotros hoy, es el coordinador de la iniciativa, el anterior rector, y junto a él hay 5 coordinadores de grandes áreas que luego el profesor Uceda nos contará. Pero también para dar más realce al acto tenemos el placer de estar acompañados hoy por el profesor Michael Batty, director del Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, que impartirá antes de la presentación de ese estado sobre la iniciativa La Ciudad del Futuro una conferencia sobre las Smart City del futuro. Para hacer la presentación del profesor Batty, le voy a hacer la palabra al profesor Uceda.
Muy bien, rector. Buenos días y muchas gracias por atender a nuestra convocatoria, a nuestra llamada. Es para mí un placer poder presentarles hoy al profesor Michael Batty. Él es profesor en University College en Londres y es actualmente el director de un centro con una excelente reputación, que es el Center for Advanced Spatial Analysis, CASA, con esa expresión tan en español, CASA. Y en los últimos años ha estado haciendo un trabajo relacionado con el modelado de las ciudades basados en la utilización intensiva de datos, que tiene una componente de innovación, en mi opinión, muy importante. Además, el profesor Batty tiene una dilatadísima carrera en su vida universitaria, tanto en el Reino Unido como fuera del Reino Unido. Del año 90 al 95 fue director de la National Science Foundation National Center for Geographic Information Analysis en la Universidad Estatal de Nueva York, en Buffalo. Ha recorrido numerosas responsabilidades en otras universidades en el Reino Unido y en centros de investigación que podría relatarles y estar un buen rato describiendo, ya digo, su trayectoria profesional. Ha publicado numerosos libros, algunos de ellos muy recientemente, que tienen que ver justamente con el nuevo concepto de ciudades y que está en estos momentos, ya digo, recientemente a disposición de los que quieran adquirirlo, como es natural, y también ha publicado numerosísimos artículos, tiene su participación en proyectos en el ámbito internacional es enorme, ha actuado como consultor de numerosísimas administraciones y compañías. En fin, yo tengo aquí, como les digo, un extensísimo currículum, pero él me ha pedido expresamente que fuera comedido en la presentación de sus méritos por ahorrar el tiempo y, como digo, pues tenemos hoy la ocasión de contar con su presencia. Va a hablarnos de esa actividad que desarrolla en ese centro de análisis espacial avanzado, que tiene una visión diferente de los entornos urbanos y que tendremos ocasión de compartir con él con la conferencia que nos va a impartir directísimamente a continuación. Y ahora permítanme dirigirme al profesor Batty en inglés. Professor Batty, now it's time to talk a little bit in English. I have been a very brief introduction of your long career in the university, in education and research, in many institutions that you have here your own just summary of your activities, and we are very happy to share with you, to listen to you, and thank you very much for accepting our invitation to be here in this event. And now the floor is yours, and we are just waiting for your speech. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for those kind comments. While the screen's coming down, let me tell you something about our center, which our colleagues mentioned was called CASA. And I realize that's a Spanish name, that I did not decide the name of our center called CASA. In 1994-5, there was a small group of people in University College London in architecture, planning, transport, geography, and geomatic engineering and archaeology who were interested in the development of geographic information systems, GIS. So they said we needed some sort of center, and so they defined it as CASA, Spatial Analysis, Centre for Advanced Spatial Analysis, that in fact the current Dean of Architecture in the Bartlett at University College, Alan Penn, he maintains that he actually decided the name CASA. And so in some senses that's a good omen, in fact, for longevity in this particular context. So we've been going about nearly 20 years as a group, and what we do in CASA is essentially apply computers to cities. Now, of course, 20 years ago, this was really all about geographic information systems and to some extent about land use transportation modeling. It was not really at all about smart cities. It was not about big data. It was not about some of the things that I'll be talking about today. One of the things that I regret is that when we set up CASA, it was the beginning of the birth of the internet. And domain names, .coms basically, were there for the taking. That I remember checking out. I'd come from the United States, and in 1993 we first had the web and we first had the domain names. It was very easy then. It might have even been easy to get the name www.casa.com basically back in 1995, but I never thought it was particularly important, etc. When it became important, it was really too late. It was too expensive to buy those domain names. Anyway, so that's a little bit of background. Let me actually begin by telling you what I'm going to talk about today. I'm obviously going to talk about future cities, but I'm going to actually talk specifically about smart cities, and then more specifically about the kind of tools that we've been developing and are continuing to develop. I say we have been developing, but lots of different groups around the world are developing, which really relate to how we might embed computers into cities. One of the key issues about smart cities is that suddenly computers have moved out of the laboratory a long time ago. They've moved out of the household. They've moved into the public domain to some extent. So we're seeing computers being embedded into the built environment, and we're also seeing, along with that, vast amounts of data being generated, because many of these computers are linked to sensors in some sense. So data is being produced in a streaming fashion. And many of the examples that I'll talk about in terms of smart cities and future cities really relate to this idea that there is new sorts of data that tell us about lots of things that traditionally we've never been able to get a handle on before in this context, largely because the data has not been available. And this is loosely referred to as big data. So my examples will really pertain to that. And I'll begin with a couple of examples. So what am I going to talk about? I'm going to talk about smart cities, which is a new paradigm, a new way of thinking about cities, largely due to the fact that computers have moved out of the individual context into this collective public context in a sense. But I'm going to begin by having sketched a few things about the new paradigm of smart cities, the new framework, if you like, for smart cities. I want to talk about two old examples which are being reinvigorated. One is land use transport modeling, and the second old example, I'll call them exemplars really, to sort of case studies really, the idea of thinking of the city not so much in terms of digital maps in 2 dimensions, but also in 3 dimensions. In other words, moving from symbolic models to iconic models or geometric models. Now, these are very old examples in the sense that they go back to really the 1960s and 70s. As soon as computers moved out of the scientific labs in the 1950s, they began to be applied in lots of areas of business, lots of areas of municipal government, and land use and transport modeling really began in the 1950s in the United States. It took a while for the development of 3D visualizations of cities in some sense. This was the beginnings of computer graphics that had a massive boost in the 1980s with the development of the PC, and also, for example, the development of companies such as AutoCAD, for example, developing the first 3D versions. But so basically these 2 examples really go back about 30 years. Most of my examples, 3, 4, and 5 here, will really deal with some of these new ideas about the cities, which I maintain really will relate to the notion of what's going to happen in the future. So I'm going to talk a lot about public transport networks and flows, because this is one of the areas that intelligence and smartness is being introduced to the city in this sense, and also it generates big data. I'm going to be talking really about the smart card technology, which is widely used in London on public transport, but we could talk about, and indeed the project that the projects that I'm working with colleagues here in Spain, in this university and so on, are really looking at mobile phone calls, etc. So a lot of these new flows, basically, from media, from RFID, from smart cards and so on, really relate to transport in that sense. I'm going to also talk about the public bike system, in this particular context, that as a small example of transportation in a sense, but interesting in the sense of looking at local movements, scaling everything down to the small scale. And then I want to shift tack completely and talk about crowdsourcing and new data. Because in some senses, one of the features about the smart city and the city of the future is all this information technology can be employed to actually engage people in this context, and we can engage them through public participation, but we can also engage them through the notion of the population at large actually producing new data, and this is referred to as crowdsourcing. The idea of getting people to actually fund things is called crowdfunding these days in this sense, but crowdsourcing is a generic thing that has come on the back of the dissemination of smart cities, the internet and so on, the web, handheld devices, really that enables a crowd of people to actually produce data on what's actually happening. And that's changing the nature of our understanding as well. Okay, so let me begin with a couple of examples about what smart cities are all about. In my view, that one of the key things is this notion of big data, which is streamed in real time. And my example, which I'll begin with, is an example from London, where the smart card data is now key. Anybody who's been to London will probably, if you get to Heathrow, for example, that's the obvious, probably, airport to go into, or even Gatwick for that matter, but Heathrow is within the area of the smart card, the so-called Oyster card. It's within the tube, it's within the Greater London Authority, which is about the 7 million people that constitute the inner metropolitan area, really, in this sense. If you go on the tube system, then one of the things to do is to buy one of these Oyster cards, which is a stored value card. You put money on it, and it reduces what you would pay on any particular trip. That's the kind of key issue in some respects. So buying the Oyster card enables you to actually move from one trip to another, not only on the subway system, the tube basically, but also on buses and to some extent on overground rail, etc. As I say here, it's accepted at 695 underground and rail stations and on thousands of buses. You can see the smart card technology here. You have to tap in and out, basically, on the tube, but you only have to tap in on a bus in that sense. And over the summer of 2012, where we have an archived data set of this Oyster card data from Transport for London, there was something nearly 1 billion tap-in, tap-outs. On any typical day, a weekday, there's about 7 million tap-in and tap-outs on the tube, and there's about 5 or 6 million tap-ins on the buses in this particular context. So there's something in the order of about 12 million on a day. On a weekend, clearly the tap-ins and tap-outs are different because the behavior is not dominated by commuting in this sense. Now, this particular data is really big data in the sense that 1 billion records, basically, which we have for this 3-month summary back in 2012. That's the summer when the Olympics was held, and the reason why we have that particular series of data is that we're very interested in analysing to see what the impact of the Olympics was. The forecast back in 2012 were that the transport system would come to a halt, it would grind to a halt. In fact, it didn't, because people adapted, and this data can actually give us an insight into that kind of change in behaviour. But this particular data is big data in the sense that it's really kind of rather unstructured data. It's just tap-in, tap-outs. The card itself that you have is classified by something like 3 or 4 different categories, perhaps a bit more in terms of if you think about how much you paid on the card, whether you have a season card, etc. But generally speaking, it's pretty anonymous data in the sense that I have a Freedom card. I'm over 60, so I get a free card, basically. Everybody over 60 in Britain gets a free bus pass, as they call it, but in London, where we have a very elaborate railway system, then you can use it on the tube, basically. And then there are young people's cards, etc., disabled cards, and so on. So there's some geodemographics in the data. But generally speaking, all it tells you is tap in and tap out, the ID number. And there's lots of complications. This is fantastic data, which is unprecedented in terms of what it does, but there are many complications. The Monday in 2010 that I looked at one Monday's data. 6.4 million people tapped in and 5.2 million people tapped out over 24 hours. Where is the missing 0.8 million? Well, the missing 0.8 million were people like me going through open barriers. Late at night, the barriers are often open. Some of the stations in suburbs, it's a kind of a goodwill thing where you have to tap onto this tap itself. You can actually get on the train without doing that, basically. So there's a lot of leakage of the data. That's the first point. There are lots of issues relating to the quality of the data in this context. One of the girls in our group, one of our lecturers, Elsa, basically drives a Prius to work. She's the only person in our group who actually drives a car to work because her husband is a hedge fund manager, so she can afford the car park in the university, basically. But anyway, she admitted the other day that she had something like 20 or 30 Oyster cards, because every time she goes on the tube, which is not that often, she buys an Oyster card, basically, buys a new Oyster card. And that's the complication you have with this big data. There's lots of uncontrolled bits. So there's good and bad in terms of big data. Now, let me just show you what we can get from this data. I'm just going to click on a movie here. This is a movie which is taken from Greater London. You can actually, this is just data on the tube and I think possibly some of the overground rail. I'll talk you through it. You're probably beginning to see bits of it. The screen's actually a little bit clearer behind you, sort of basically. But what we're seeing here is peak hour. I'll talk you through it. There's a little counter in the top right which says CASA. And at the moment it's saying Tuesday 1400, 1500, okay, and then Tuesday evening, Wednesday, we're coming around to the peak hour, and suddenly you'll see this bulging, basically. It's like a heart throbbing in some senses. And then Wednesday, peak hour, and then we're going to look at Thursday at this particular point. The peak hour at this particular point, 9 a.m. in the morning, etc., and then a slowdown, and then in the afternoon peak, basically. And then in the late evening, there's a little peak in the late evening, which is sort of the entertainment stuff in central London. And then, of course, once we get into the weekend, you get a very different peaking in this sense. Now, one of the key features, this data, this flow pattern has been reconstructed from these millions of tap-in, tap-outs, basically. And if we examine any one segment between two tube stations, there's lots of tricks we have to do to interpret the data. We have to, when somebody taps in and they tap out somewhere else in the system, we have to work out what tube train they're actually on. There's no data that tells us that, and there are many ways through the system. So we use shortest routes. We have lots of wayfinding techniques to look at that, but that's by no means a perfect science in any sense. So essentially, what we're actually having to do is to construct this data from the tap-in, tap-out. So there's a number of issues involved in this. But clearly, in some sense, when we examine any particular segment, it's always different. Even over a 5-minute period, the people tapping in and tap out, the degree of regularity in the system is quite low at one level. In other words, somebody who taps into the same place in the morning and taps out at the same place in the evening will probably not do it at precisely the same time. And so in some sense, we have to look at the regularity by putting these windows of time across it, in a sense. But it's highly heterogeneous data. Only 7% of the billion or so trips in this particular context, tap-ins and tap-outs basically, pertain really to what we would call regular commuting. That doesn't mean to say that we're missing all the commuters really in some sense. They're there basically, but the regularity of commuting is much more heterogeneous. It's much more variable than we ever thought. And that's one of the things about the city. The city is a much more variable animal, so to speak, than we've ever thought of before. Okay, so that's basically, I'll come back to the Oyster card data set in a moment. Here's another example. I didn't have time to log on this morning and sort of look at this, but this is planefinder.net. Planefinder.net basically is a site that you can go to on your phone, and it gives you all the planes in the air at any particular point in time across the world, and you can click on the plane. This is over Stansted, I think, basically, and these are the planes that are flying into Stansted. Actually, they might be flying into Southend, basically. Southend has a little airport in this context. So you can see that you've got information on the planes, and in fact, Planefinder has various apps connected to it that enable you to see things in 3D. There's the app, basically, in a sense, and you can actually sort of look at a variety of things. It's not a million miles away to what you actually see on a flight in terms of, and that sort of information that you see on the flight in terms of where the plane is collected together in this particular context and pumped out in real time. It's essentially free. And that's the kind of thing that's happening in lots and lots of transport in this context. Here's an example of big data penetrating the idea of the collective consciousness. This is Heathrow. This is an advert for a company called EMC Squared, basically, which is a big data company in this context. Once big data gets onto the side of taxi cabs and into Heathrow and into advertisements and so on, that you know it's a significant change in some respect in this context. And if I use big data to look at big data, this is Google Trends, and these graphs are I key in different words. So, for example, I've keyed in cloud computing, big data, and Web 2, and you can see that Web 2 peaked basically in 2007. These are the number of Google searches, basically, and you can see that the red one, which is big data, this was probably done about 6 months ago, so it'll be different, is beginning to peak. So you see these waves of innovation, basically, that really pertain to things that pertain to the futurist cities and the smart cities. Okay, let me spend 5 minutes just talking very briefly about smart cities, and then we'll move on to some more examples. The term smart cities, a peculiarly American word. I lived in America for about 5 years, and the Americans use it to refer to people as smart people, etc. We British don't use it very much in this particular context. Obviously, we do use it basically, but often we refer to smart people in a rather sarcastic way, basically, a smart ass or something like that, basically somebody who's sort of kind of too clever for their own good, basically. But the Americans use it literally, and indeed in planning, for example, and urban development, the idea of smart growth really preceded the idea of the smart city. So the smart city is a peculiarly American word, and it's been jumped upon by the big computer companies who are beginning to sell their wares to cities in general in that sense. So if you log on to the IBM, in fact, have the Smart Planet Initiative, which the smart cities are embraced within it in this particular context. So smart city, in some sense, is this collective noun, really, this collective noun for a whole variety of things that relate to computers, but particularly computers that have moved out of the corporate and individual domains into the collective domain of the city to control things and to deliver services. So to potentially control things like the tube system, I'll give you an example of that, but also to deliver services which traditionally were delivered using manual means. And that ranges from everything from Amazon.com all the way through to a municipality putting their services and their participation into an online context so that the citizenry at large can actually begin to interact in this context. Now, the big change that's happening in terms of cities is that once the smart city and big data began to appear within the last 10 years, the focus of interest was changing. If you go back 10 or 15 years, most people thinking about cities were thinking about what happened in cities over the next 5 years, or maybe over the next 50 years, or the next 10 years, etc. Maybe over the next year, but generally speaking, not over the next 5 minutes or the next 5 hours or even the next 5 days. That with stream data, with temporal data, in fact, if you go back 15, 20 years, the idea of temporal data pertaining to cities, we really didn't have any to speak of. We had the decennial census, etc., and there was some data emerging, loop counters for traffic, etc., is clearly dynamic in that sense. But really, the emergence of this stream data has changed the focus to from longer term to short term in this context. And many of the examples, etc., in this talk really will relate to the short term rather than the long term. But I will begin with talking a little bit about the long term in a moment, my first example. So I've talked about what's on this slide. I've talked about the big data, the billion Oyster card records in 3 months. Now, my personal definition, it's not mine, I got it from somewhere, but we can't credit it to anybody because it's hard to find now. But somebody once said to me that big data is anything that won't fit into an Excel spreadsheet. Now, Excel spreadsheets have got to 1 million rows, basically. If you put a million rows, filled it up in an Excel spreadsheet, you couldn't do anything with it. It would just actually freeze, basically, on the desktop. But nevertheless, the spreadsheets are getting bigger, etc. But big data is much bigger than what we can use with standard databases such as Excel and so on, DBase technologies, etc. So you need new techniques to actually mine the data. And a lot of thinking about how we understand patterns in the data is really related to things such as the development of machine learning, new kinds of algorithms, etc., to search patterns in the data. The data also tends to be very unstructured in this sense, a bit like my Oyster card data. Doesn't tell you very much until you begin to dig into it and begin to look at some of the variability. Okay, my 2 examples, I've mentioned those. I'm talking about building land use transport models, which really have been going on for a long time, and I'll talk about 3D. So typically, these are some pictures taken, but this is Greater London, for example, which is from a visual interface to a land use transport model that we built for the wider region to look at climate change. This was part of an integrated assessment to look at climate change in Greater London. We were responsible for the allocation of population and employment to the small zones of the city. Think of Madrid divided into these census tracts, basically, and think of a model that is related to how you locate population and traffic and all of this sort of stuff. This particular model was set within a much wider context of an input-output model driving the regional dynamics, developed by a group at Cambridge, ourselves at UCL developing the land use transport model, then a GIS model at the fine scale, 50-metre resolution, dealing with the land capabilities, etc., developed by the group at Newcastle, and then the hydrologists coming in with their flooding models, because the key issue in Greater London is over the next 100 years, the reasonable forecast suggests the North Sea will rise by about 1 metre. If that's the case, we'll get severe flooding events along the Thames estuary. Of course, within 100 years, there'll be a lot of adaptation and mitigation will have gone on in terms of, so we won't get this sort of flooding. But the forecast would be if nothing happened, we'd get quite substantial flooding. And indeed, in London, we already saw evidence of that back in 1953. The Thames barrage that was put in place in the 1980s, which is basically big gates that come down when you have a surge tide, had a design life of about 100 years, but that's gone down to about 50 years with climate change. So this was a fairly practical project. One of the things you can see from this slide, and the next slide too, is that we're making use of a lot of visual technologies that really, in fact, preceded the development of ideas in smart cities, but nevertheless have really dominated what's happened in terms of the applications of these models over the last 10, 20 years. GIS technology, putting maps onto computers, basically, really began in the 1980s in this particular context, and now it's almost routine, basically, in this sense. And then the development of 3D, this is a Google Earth plugin to the desktop land use transport model, which shows you the kind of capabilities that we've actually got for disseminating these tools, in a sense. So they're old tools, but new kind of visualizations in that sense. Now, the second example, again, old ideas about 3D. In fact, if you go back to the 60s, then very few people ever thought that you could think about the computers being used to represent, as it were, 3D geometries in that sense. Clearly, computers and geometry go together in that sense, but the idea of representing a city in 3D in this context really only came with the microcomputer revolution in the 1980s with AutoCAD and so on. But nevertheless, these are fairly routine. So I'll show you an example of these. They date for 10 years or so. This is our virtual London model, so-called, and the virtual London model is essentially a digital map, basically, and LiDAR data, low-flying aircraft, producing 3D clouds, basically, and extruding these blocks. And if you fly around here, we're flying down the Thames, basically. Some of these buildings, about 50 of these buildings are rendered in detail, but most of them are blocks. And the reason why we're building these sorts of models within the last 10, 15, 20 years is so that we can tag, so that we can, again, disseminate data about what's happening, but to these blocks, we can actually tag social and economic data. Most social and economic data that we've got comes in census tracts, very abstract in that sense. To actually disseminate it to people who see the city in a literal sense, basically, then we can tag these buildings with things. So that gives you an idea. You could see that one or two of these buildings were rendered in greater detail, but most of them are blocks. And we have in this model about 3 million buildings, of which about 2 million, I should say, are things like chimney stacks and sheds and things of that sort. So there's about 1 million buildings in the 7 million, significant buildings, I should say, in the 7 million, for the 7 million people in Greater London. And essentially, it really is now almost routine to produce this kind of model. Once you have the data, the software is such that it perhaps takes a matter of an afternoon to build a model of this kind. And in fact, in Google Earth, for example, you see lots of these models already imported. Now, I have a very nice, and we can put this into Google Earth. Okay, I'm going to stop that at that point. You've got some sense of the idea. But this is putting the data from ArcGIS, the GIS that was built in, the 3D GIS, putting it into Google Earth. Now, one of the key features that when we originally did this, and this is a very generic problem in terms of cities, and it relates to data and who owns it, etc. The Ordnance Survey, which is the national mapping agency, part of government in Britain, they charge for their data. They would not let us put this into Google Earth. Because basically, if we put this out on the web, anybody could actually see this model within Google Earth. And we have this famous story, basically, when Google came to us about 10 years ago, and sort of they'd bought the keyhole company who built the Google Earth thing in the first instance. They wanted to actually put the model in, and we said, well, we can't do that because the data does not belong to us. And they said, well, who does the data belong to? And we said, it belongs to the Ordnance Survey. And Google said, who are the Ordnance Survey? We said, well, it's the National Mapping Agency. And they said, well, can we buy it? Right, this is what Google said. Right? No, it's pretty difficult to buy the Ordnance Survey. It goes back to about 1750. They said, well, who owns it? Well, of course, the answer to that is the Queen, right? The Queen of England owns it, basically. So, but that was the issue. That one of the things was we did put it into Google Earth, and the interesting issue was that the local authorities in London all have Ordnance Survey licenses, so they can put the model into Google Earth and use it. What they didn't have was ArcGIS licenses. They had MapInfo licenses. So, interestingly enough, Google basically had provided the media, in fact, for the project to be disseminated to local authorities. I want to show you one last thing, because I'm quite conscious of time here, and I know people are, and I'll race through some of this stuff. It's very impressionistic. I just want to show you another thing that we've actually tagged to the model. So this is tagging the a 3D visualization of nitrogen dioxide, which is taken from the sensor. There's a sensor network across London. Every hour, pollutants at various points on a density of about 150 sensors across Greater London. Quite a crude network, are actually provided in the public domain. There's a website you can get this data from. You could probably get it faster, I suspect, if you inquired, basically. It's in the public domain. And then basically there's a group at King's College London who actually sort of build a traffic model and synthesize the traffic model with the pollutants, etc. And what you're seeing here is nitrogen dioxide, which is mainly connected to cars, and it's mainly these big peaks are basically the stopping and starting of cars at big intersections, basically. So again, one of the key issues is to bring alive the data in some respects, but also to tag it, to associate a rather abstract pollution surface with an actual rather literal 3D surface in that sense. And in many senses, it's much more appropriate to a wide audience to look at things in this context rather than to actually simply plot it on a map in that context. Now, I'm going to move very quickly. I did say that one of the projects was related to climate change, and again, this is an accessibility map. If we ask the question, if all the bridges were closed as far as Hammersmith, which is in West London, what would happen to the traffic pattern, then many of these tools now would be able to show that the traffic pattern would change. You can see that in this context, this is the existing traffic pattern in terms of its density. If we were to close all those bridges to, anybody who knows London, if you go more or less to the centre of the picture and a little bit west, you get to Hyde Park, close all the bridges right the way from the estuary all the way through, and the traffic pattern would switch in that sense. So that's very typical of these sorts of models, basically. Okay, let me try and speed up and then talk about public transport networks and flows. Now, I've talked about our Oyster card data in this sense. These are some pictures from the Oyster card data. You can see the little proportional circles in the map. These are on top of tube stations, and the green shows tap-ins and tap-outs. So we've got that data, of course, for every time period we can think of over this 3 months, basically. And here we have on the right, you can see the very typical, pattern of tube stations. These are tube stations, basically, on the right. This is a temporal interval in the sense of the morning peak and the afternoon peak. Anybody who's looked at traffic data will be very familiar with this particular context. And this is an example of the number of tap-in, tap-outs at stations. The mainline stations which intersect with tube lines are the big ones. So London Bridge, for example, is 600,000 tap-in, tap-outs a day. This is back in the November 2010 data. And you can get a sense of the activity going on in these places by just looking at the amount of stuff coming in and out of tube stations in this context. And that's another picture of the data in this particular context. The morning peak is very different from the evening peak. It's similar structurally in this sense, but different in detail, basically, in this particular context. The evening peak is perhaps a bit more elongated than the morning peak. Again, you see this data in lots of data. We've known about this. And then this is the actual cycle over the whole day for hub entry in this particular context. And you can see that where it says night, that means that the tube closes about 2:30 in the morning and opens again about 4:45, although there are proposals to actually keep it open all night at the moment. But you can see a massive change in the amount of traffic on the network in terms of these. So all of the characteristic signatures of what we know about cities are writ large in this kind of data. Okay, now here's an example of 4 different subway stations and looking at the data. The data is weekday data and Saturday, Sunday data, basically. The different colours pertain to it. And each of these are 4 different subway stations. The one on the top right is at the Arsenal, right? I perhaps shouldn't mention soccer, basically, sort of in this audience, but you can't mention it much in Britain at the moment either. Anyway, this is the Arsenal, and you can actually see there's a couple of weekend games there, basically, one starting at something like 3 o'clock, the normal 3 o'clock Saturday afternoon, and one starting in the evening, and then there's a midweek game. So the Arsenal subway station is really dominated by these big peaks. Again, quite expected. If we look at the one on the bottom left, basically, and the way this is represented is the tap-ins and tap-outs are on the minus scale, and the tap-ins are on minus and tap-outs on the vertical, on the plus scale in that sense. So in a sense, that's a bank, basically, the Bank of England, which is in the heart of the city, and that's really showing you what you would expect in a sense. And then these other ones, one is Camden Town, the top left, which is a mixture of residential, entertainment and so on, and the other is Bayswater, which might pertain to tourism around Hyde Park and so on. So to interpret these signatures in detail, and of course they're changing all the time, every day, there's a seasonal dimension. There's many trends in these things. So this is the kind of richness of the data we've got. Now, I want to show you one of the things that back in 2012, the circle and the district line were closed for something like 4 hours, basically, from 8 o'clock till noon. And that's a major disruption. You know, it's probably a signaling disruption, etc. But it meant that everybody on the tube network who was using it, and there was something like 1 million Oyster card users using it during that 4-hour period, identifiable, were affected in some sense. The system repercussions were really very wide in that sense that basically, it says here, from the data, 1.23 million Oyster card holders were somehow disadvantaged. Their work was a little bit longer, or the ones who were most disadvantaged switched mode. They went off the line onto buses, etc. We've got all that sort of data. So in other words, this kind of data can really look at disruption. Now, Transport for London don't use this data. They've not got the data, although it's streamed in real time, and they're getting it all the time, there really isn't a technology yet to actually use it in real time to manage passenger demand. What you see on the gantries, the electronic gantries, are basically a mixture of manual and data coming from the tube trains itself rather than from the actual tap-in, tap-out. So the demand data, the tap-in, tap-out, has not yet been used in real time to manage the system, and also the tap-in, tap-out data has not been linked to the positioning data in terms of the trains. So to really look at disruption, we need to link the demand to the supply. If you're on a train and it gets disrupted, you're disrupted, but then the train carries on after the disruption, after the stoppage, basically, and lots of passengers are getting onto that train who've not been disrupted because you have this steady stream of passengers. So to some extent, the disruption problem is really quite a complicated one. And again, it's an example of a new problem, I think, in a sense. People have talked about disruption in the past, but they've never been able really to do anything about it in that sense. Okay, so this actually shows increased travel time at this particular point. We have, in fact, APIs out there that give us positions of tube trains, buses, and heavy rail, etc. And this is an example of the tube trains speeded up, basically. Those are the lines. So we have tube trains. Think about linking this to the Oyster card demand data. This is the supply of trains. Think about linking the Oyster card demand data, the tap-in, tap-out, to this. And the big problem then is, of course, in the smart city, we often talk about data integration. The big problem in this particular context is that once somebody gets into the tube station, we don't know where they're going to go. We'll know where they tap out, we think, as long as they're not missed on an open barrier. But basically, we don't know what line they use. And in particular, we don't know what train they're getting on because there's no way of monitoring them as they actually get to the, as they actually get into the station in this particular context. So that's a big technical issue for Transport for London. How do they link these two big data sets, or two or more big data sets they've got, when there's bits of missing data which happen? And if you're in one of these complicated subway stations, then it's anybody's guess how long it takes you to actually, if there's 4 or 5 lines converging, to actually move between lines. It depends on your knowledge of the system, a whole range of things that are really highly subjective. So these are the research challenges. Delays from national rail and bus, I'm going to miss that, basically. Okay, normally what we see in this particular context is the tube map. Okay, I'm going to go back to the tube map there. This is normally what we see. In fact, it's much more complicated than that, this map that I'm going to show you is putting all of the networks on top of each other. So if you look at the Tokyo subway map, it looks much more like this, because in Tokyo, they put national rail on top of subways, etc., the different subway companies. So here we've got tube, overground rail, national rail, etc., and things like cable cars and trams and stuff like that in that context, but we don't have bus routes on it in a sense. So the system is extremely complex, and much of what I'm talking about really is to deal with and to manage and deal and understand with this kind of complexity. Okay, very quickly, then bikes data. We've got a lot of data. We have a guy in our group, Oliver O'Brien, who is an expert on bikes, basically, and he has a very nice website which has something like 90-odd schemes around the world, which are all represented in terms of in terms of the docks where the bikes are located, the number of bikes in the docks, etc., for public bike schemes, because most of these public bike schemes are online. Since they were introduced, probably about 7-8 years ago, the way to get access to them is actually online, in some sense, using a credit card or whatever. So essentially the data is available in a public context, etc. Ollie's site is very nice. You can do lots of things with it. In this context, this is London, basically, and the red represent empty docks, or degree of emptiness, and the blue full docks, basically. And you can play an animation, and you can actually see, in the case of the public bike scheme, you know, we're not talking here about billions of records. We're talking about basically something in the order of 10,000 bikes available per day, basically. So it's a much smaller, but of course all of that data is streamed and it's online, and so we know the time, the location, and so on. We don't know the routes. It's a slightly different problem from the tube problem in this context. But what you see, if I played an animation of this, you would see that the morning peak, the bikes are mainly used for people coming in to the centre, to the mainline stations and the big hubs, picking up a bike and then riding it to work and then docking it, basically. So you see a kind of wave effect of people coming in the morning and going out to the mainline stations around the centre in this particular context. Let me just see if I can log on to this. This is a good test. No, I can't locate. There's no EduRoam here, basically. Sort of. There probably is, but it would probably take me half an hour to get through the firewalls, etc. I know you've got EduRoam because I've used it when I've been here before. But anyway, if you get this is Ollie's scheme, so if you key in bikes, Oliver O'Brien, CASA, etc. I was going to show you the Barcelona scheme, which is the example that the group we're working with in Nomon and in Palma are working with. Nevertheless, again, a good data source in a sense. There's a few examples. That's the Barcelona scheme, similar sorts of things. That's the Miami scheme, etc. So I've shown lots of examples of flow data. Now, to really to move on to something else, basically, then essentially a lot of this flow data, which is streamed in real time, can be captured and presented. And what's become very popular in the last 2-3 years for many, many places, and I'm sure there are lots of places here, Madrid itself, Barcelona and so on, where these so-called city dashboards have been created. Now, this is the city dashboard we've created for London. It's not the official one. If you go to the London Data Store, the GLA have their official dashboard. But basically, this is a dashboard that contains a whole variety of data, which is actually streamed in real time. And it's simply counting the data and putting it into a kind of a one-stop shop or portal where you can actually see what's happening. So if you actually look in detail at this, you can see things like, obviously, it tells you the quality of the service on the tube lines. That's very routine. It tells you what's happening in terms of weather stations, etc., temperature, rainfall, and so on. It's telling you what happens in terms of the cycle hire. Obviously, that's online data, we've just seen that. And a variety of other things, BBC London News, etc. All of these things that are changing rapidly in a matter of minutes and hours, basically, are somehow encapsulated into this. Now, there are lots of versions of the dashboard. Of course, the critical issue is lots of cities are interested in taking this kind of data and producing a performance index, in some sense, of how well is the city doing. Now, there's not much in this data, apart from a little bit on congestion, etc., which talks much about how London is doing. But I have seen dashboards, for example, Amsterdam have a dashboard which really looks at things like unemployment. Now, it's a dashboard that is not working on a daily basis, but it is working on a weekly or monthly basis in that sense, where you have quite significant figures about economic performance. In Britain, for example, you could probably now produce quite a good dashboard for house prices, basically, because the land registry are monitoring house prices and putting the data out under open data, basically. So you can see the frequency of house sales, etc., is, you'd probably have to think of it weekly, really, to get any significant variation, basically. But nevertheless, it's locational, and that's the kind of thing that I think we're going to see emerging in terms of these sorts of dashboards. They're picking up this stream data, this big data, and displaying it for a whole variety of different purposes. Okay, now we've done lots of work on fine-scale modeling as well. We've built these things called agent-based models, and this is a model of the Notting Hill Carnival, basically. Now I'm going to flip over that. We're working also with, we're interested in the diffusion of information on networks. So, for example, we have a variety of digital data pertaining to how people move, and we're quite interested in thinking about how epidemics spread in cities using these new concepts of networks and so on in this particular context. So that's another area that I've skipped over very quickly, but again, it's bringing this sort of data down to the fine scale. If I just go back a little bit, that increasingly pedestrian movement, etc., is being captured in real time from individual phones, etc. It's being captured by cameras and so on. All of this stuff potentially has the power to be integrated in some way. Lots of problems in doing this. I'm not trying to minimize those at all. And there are lots of things that we'll never be able to do, and maybe we don't want to do because of privacy and confidentiality. But there is a great sort of renaissance, if you like, of thinking about fine temporal scales and fine spatial scales. And we see that particularly in models of movement. 10, 15 years ago, you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody building pedestrian models of how people, walk through airports or shopping centres. But these are really quite widely employed now in this particular context. And increasingly, the data to support them is being actually generated from sensors within the environment. Okay, let me move on to my last main topic, which is crowdsourcing and new data. We have a number of mapping projects in our group using Web 2, and we're particularly interested in online mapping. Now, this is pretty, 5, 6, 7 years ago, this was quite new to some extent, putting digital maps online, basically, in some senses. But when we started this work, we had a project called MapTube, which enables you to put maps online, basically. And indeed, at the Home Affairs editor of the BBC basically is very interested in maps, and he approached us and said he was interested. They were interested in running this program on the credit crunch in 2008 on Radio 4. Radio 4 were going to broadcast this half-hour program on the credit crunch, and they said as part of this, we'd like to put out a website. And the listeners to this program can log on to, we'd like to ask them to log on to the website and answer some questions. And it would be interesting to know where they'd logged on for, etc. So we built an interface to the website that enabled them, if you log on and you answer a question, which are simple questions about the program in a sense. So the program is broadcast, and it's all about the credit crunch. A number of questions are then asked about the importance to you individually of the credit crunch. And once you actually tick the box, basically, it then asks you for your postcode. That's the key. Asks you for the postcode. Our server went off every half hour scanning the BBC database, basically, and built up an online map, basically, which showed how people were actually responding. Now, as I say, this was first done for the credit crunch, so you can see Radio 4, basically, this is our MapTube thing, and these are the questions that were asked. Basically, what single factor is hurting you most? Now, this was back in 2008. Mortgage or rent, petrol prices, food prices, and so on. We got in originally about 23,000 responses to the program, basically, so 23,000 people responded by getting onto the website and answering it and putting in their postcode, the georeference code. And then it was run again, basically, in October, and there were a lot more responses. At the time of this slide being prepared, there were about 4,000. The survey just started again. And this is the kind of map one gets, basically. So this was the map initially on the left, and this was the final map on the right. Probably to interpret that map, you'd need to know a little bit about Britain. There's obviously a rural-urban distinction in some sense in terms of what's important in this particular context. But we've tried this a number of times. So this is crowdsourcing. This is, 30 or 40,000 responses, basically, to those questions and the spatial location. We did it again with antisocial behaviour. This is East Anglia. It's the kind of bit that sticks out north of London, basically, sense. And That's controlled by BBC Look East, basically. That's the local news programme. This time the broadcasting was done on TV during the news programme. And in fact, I think we might even have a movie of this with a bit of sound. So if you bear with me for a minute or so, I can just show you essentially what was happening at that point.
We're trying to get a picture of what life is like across the region, and we need your help.
If you go to the Look East website and look for our section on antisocial behaviour, you'll get the chance to say what's going on in your part of the world. Of course, this is not scientific, just a snapshot. You have to fill in your postcode and choose one of the options, for example, noisy neighbours. You'll then be able to see a colour-coded map of the region. So far, more than 2,000 of you have taken part, and this is what the map is showing. Red is for drunken youths, yellow for noisy neighbours, light blue for boy racers, dark blue for no problems, and green for great community with no problems. It's based on postcodes, so just because there's a lot of one colour, it doesn't mean that whole area has a huge problem. Remember, rural postcodes are bigger than urban ones. Over the summer, we'll return to this interactive map to see how it evolves. The more of you who take part, the better picture we'll have of what you think. Our website is at bbc.co.uk/lookeast, and we also want to hear your stories about antisocial behaviour. You can either email us via the website or call us on the usual number. Stuart.
Okay, so that gives a classic example of crowdsourcing. We've done this. Whoops. We've done this to the Manchester congestion charge. They thought they would introduce a congestion charge in Manchester like London. That's a ring around the centre of London where you pay when you cross during peak hour, during the working day, I should say. The blue represents they would work or shop elsewhere, meaning they didn't want the congestion charge. Only people right in the centre of Manchester would be exempt from it, wanted it, basically, in that sense. So interesting, too, that this was not restricted to Manchester. It's really the whole of the northwest and even into parts of the Midlands, etc. People were logging on and actually answering it. We have a version of this called Survey Mapper. One of our most successful ones has been the simplest. Again, Look East, the BBC. We asked people to actually simply key on the website, and there was a little gizmo on the website that went off and examined the broadband speed test. You know, internet providers often advertise a certain speed at which your broadband is working, and rarely, it would appear in most people's experience, do you get that speed. So this was actually a crowdsourcing of finding the speed. Very simple in a sense, and in fact very, very effective. Many thousands of entries in this particular context. Okay, now all of this is related to in a sense, new kinds of media to some extent, new kinds of data, etc. And we, like many groups, are interested in what this new data is telling us. This is the London Twitter cloud, basically. So you can see here that, and I'll play this because it actually brings together the 3D stuff, which I mentioned earlier on, and also social media, etc. So this is Greater London. So I switched it off, basically. I muted it. But essentially what we're doing here is we've geolocated the tweets. Now, the big problem with social media is that most social media is not georeferenced, basically. Only about, we reckon, 5%, it depends where you are, 5% of tweets are georeferenced. Most 5% of people tweeting have got the geo capabilities actually switched on in that sense. But what we're seeing here is where these tweets are occurring over time, basically. And as this movie runs round, we'll actually see some interesting things. This is Heathrow Airport, and this was a time when you couldn't switch your phone on when you were actually on the runway. But in actual fact, there's quite a lot of people tweeting. When these planes have landed, there's quite a lot of people tweeting, basically, who shouldn't be tweeting because they've obviously ignored what the British Airways stewardess or the EasyJet stewardess has actually said, basically, in a sense. So in some senses, it's kind of interesting, you know, in an anecdotal sense, but you're seeing the density of tweets in this sense. Now, lots of people have done stuff on this. There are very strong limits to this social media data, but again, it's another example of things which are being streamed in real time, basically. Okay, and of course, looking at the content of the tweets is problematic, basically, in some senses. Somebody's, you know, basically saying happy birthday in terms of the tweet or something at that point. But nevertheless, this is the kind of world that we're really into, and it's obviously relevant in terms of the future cities and smart cities. Okay, we can plot maps of tweets. One of our guys has done this. And there's a variety of things we've done in this particular context. And returning to our old exemplars, the two I began with, now I'll finish in a couple of minutes at this point. Let me say something about the traditional models being informed by much of this big data, this new media, etc., and indeed new techniques of visualization, and the visualization in an online context. So, for example, we're very interested in our group in thinking about social and economic data. The reason why we were really interested in the 3D stuff was largely so we could actually use it as a kind of set of filing cabinets in 3D, the city blocks basically, and to tag social and economic data. So these are not skyscrapers, this is land value data basically for offices and retail, the two differences, offices being the dark blue and the retail being the yellow. And basically you can see here Canary Wharf, which is the second central business district, office towers basically, and then you can see the city and the West End in terms of rents. So this is the kind of data that, again, is being streamed routinely from our land registry, etc., and potentially we can build maps of this every time the data is refreshed. We can build a new map of this. So this is the new online dynamic world. The other thing that's captured the interest of our people, particularly Andy Hudson-Smith, who's very key to all this, is that you can buy these drones, basically. And one of our students went out to, with the development planning unit to Lima and actually used one of these drones to actually produce a 3D topographic digital elevation model of the area they were looking at, and then built with very simple technologies a lot of information which pertained to the local community. So it was an interesting mixture of local deprived communities in Lima, Peru, and also these new low-cost technologies to actually produce this stuff. And here is, again, another example of Twitter, a Twitter map, basically, pertaining to the 3D model that we've actually got. Okay, let me round it off. I've not really mentioned much of technology other than the internet and desktop computers, etc. in this sense. We talked a little bit about sensing devices, but one of the key issues is that a lot of the data that is being sensed, basically, is not from fixed sensors like you get with the Oyster card data. It's actually from handheld devices, so it's from mobile phones. And in some senses, that's a completely new world in some respects, because clearly it relates to who has mobile phones, what they're using them for. So we've mentioned tweets, for example. Lots of tweets, most tweets maybe are not from phones, I don't know. I mean, most people in our group who tweet seem to tweet from their computers rather than their phones, basically. So there's a mixture of the devices being used, and that's important. But mobile telephone calls, of which there's an awful lot of interest at the present time in terms of what it can tell us about traffic and demand and supply and this kind of thing. Mobile telephone calls, of course, are in fact intrinsic to the device, etc. All of us who have mobile phones are being captured at some point by in terms of location by the providers in this particular context. And so there's an awful lot of things that I've not been saying but need to be said probably in terms of the future city about mobile devices in this particular context. Not mentioned much on digital participation, a little bit on crowdsourcing in some sense, and that's key to smart cities movement in a sense. We could have given a lecture talking about all the apps that have spun off in this particular context from this. And if you read Anthony Townsend's book on smart cities. That came out last year. Then a lot of that sort of stuff is contained within his view of the smart cities terrain in that sense. And last but not least, in some sense, all of this sits within what a number of us have referred to as the new science of cities, or the science of cities in that sense, that, in other words, a lot of what was in the past about cities over space and time needs to be refashioned, if you like, and a lot of new science needs to be extracted and abstracted from this kind of new world, etc. We need to think much more about time and the impact of time in cities. And then, of course, we need to think about how planning, in the most generic sense, actually fits into all this context. And that's probably particularly important, because the reason why we're doing all of this in the first and the last instance really is to actually produce better cities. Okay, now, I'm going to stop at that point. Thank you very much. And let me just make some acknowledgements there to my group of people. Andy Hudson-Smith, who has a very senior role in CASA now, and is responsible really for our 3D stuff. And then all the other guys who are basically on short-term contracts, basically, and depend on me and my colleagues, some who are here in the audience, actually applying for research grants to keep them in employment. Okay, and last but not least, here's a bunch of the books that we've written over the last few years on GIS and cities and agent-based models and so on. If you look at those books, you won't find an awful lot on smart cities and sensing or anything. That's really almost too new in some sense, so it's a new world in this particular context. Thank you very much.